Hey guys, so this is going to be a quick lecture video on half of notes number 3. Notes number 3 is kind of long, so I'm going to divide it up into two parts. So let's open up the notes. So on this particular one, so here's notes number 3, we're going to cover section 1, section 2, 3, 4, and 5. The next one will be from 6 and on. All right, so title of notes number 3 is the New Deal. As we've talked about briefly, the New Deal is the name given to the programs that FDR is going to create and install into our government. When and all this starts with the 1932 election. So 1932 election is 3.5 years after the stock market has crashed, 3.5 years of President Hoover and the Republicans running our government. 3.5 years of Republicans doing trickle-down economics, as we talked about. That was their way of fixing the economy, that you would give tax breaks to the rich, who would use that money that they saved on taxes to create jobs. And as we talked about so many times before, if there's new jobs, it means more money for people, which means more spending, which means businesses go up because there's more spending. And when businesses go up, they create more jobs, which means even more jobs, which means even more money, even more spending, even more business. And that's how you're supposed to work your way out of a bad economic period. But as we talked about with trickle-down economics, the reason it doesn't work is because there's no rule or law that says that even if they get the tax breaks, that they actually have to use that money on jobs. So people were kept on waiting for this trickling down of the jobs to come out, and very few did. So in the 32 election, President Hoover is going to run for re-election versus a new candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who happens to be a Democrat. So we're going to go back and look at this image of the 28 election before the stock market crash to see how people in the country looked at not only Hoover, but the Republicans. And as you can see, Hoover represented by red, tons of red all over the place because the 20s looked like they had was a good economy. So they basically told the Republicans, you're doing a good job. So Hoover gets elected very easily. 4 years later, the election we're talking about in the notes, it's him versus FDR, and it's a whole other ballgame because people are tired of the Republicans, tired of their trickle-down economics, and FDR had run for office with the idea that he was going to spend. And as we talked about in one of the key terms, we didn't have the money to spend, but he was going to spend it anyways, which is also known as deficit spending, which is supposed to be a bad thing. But when people are suffering on the streets and living in shantytowns and not eating every day, you don't care that they're going to spend a lot of money today that they'll have to worry about later. So his idea, what he told American people was, elect me, and I essentially have to break down the government and then reconstruct it, like rebuild it back up. That rebuilding is all the acts and agencies that he's going to create called the New Deal. And that New Deal is super expensive, lots and lots of spending, again, that we didn't have, which is called deficit spending. And if you look at the map, the people said, yeah, we want you to come in and spend, because we need it now. So a huge victory. No other sitting president like Hoover, who was already president, ran for re-election, has ever been destroyed this badly. It showed how people were done with the Republicans and how desperate they were that FDR come bring this change and the spending that he promised. So it was a huge, huge victory. One of the reasons why it was a huge victory is because he got support by a group that had never really supported Democrats before. And that, of course, is African Americans. Why had they always been Republicans? Simple. President Abraham Lincoln, who technically freed slaves, and eventually the 13th Amendment made it legal to have slaves, he was a Republican. So African Americans became Republicans. But sometime in the late 1800s, 30 years after the Civil War is done, the Republican Party kind of switched platforms. They switched what they believed in, and they became the party of the rich and business way more than the party of the people. So by 1932, when FDR runs for president, he tells African Americans, why are you still Republicans? Republicans are looking out for the rich and businesses, not you. And they switched over to Democrats. FDR will win his first election in 1932, but he will be elected 4 times. 32, 36, 40, and 44. Only president ever to be elected 4 times. Only president to ever elected 3 times. And eventually they will pass an amendment making it only 2 terms minimum, a maximum for a president, and it is because of FDR. But now they have to wait for Roosevelt to take over. He got elected in November of 32, and presidents used to go into the White House. The inauguration of becoming president was in March. They passed the 20th Amendment to move it to January, 6 weeks earlier. Why? Because they were desperate. They wanted FDR to come in already quickly and start making the changes. So in the New Deal, which is all the acts and agencies, all that money he had to spend, he had three goals in order how to achieve and make the New Deal good. They were called the three R's: relief for the needy, economic recovery, and financial reform. These are the three goals that he had to go through. So first was direct relief, simple, give money or food directly to the people. Second one is economic recovery. We have to fix the economy. And the way we're going to fix the economy is by helping two groups: the banks and the farmers. So we talked about in the key terms that they passed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to help the banks get better. We also talked about the farmers with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Paid them not to farm to help the farmers get better. And there's going to be more acts for both banking and farming. But the idea was simple. We want to fix the economy. We got to fix the banks and we got to fix the farmers. The last goal was financial reform. We got to fix our financial system, specifically and most importantly, the stock market. We saw what happens to an economy when the stock market crashes. So we never want that to happen again. So they're going to pass a lot of rules and regulations to make sure that nobody messes with the stock market, nobody lies to the stock market, nobody does any shady things in the stock market. But what they needed is somebody to pay attention to that. So they created the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, which, like I mentioned, was basically the stock market police. And they made sure that nobody messed with the stock market or they will throw you in jail. And Section 2 is the first 100 days. First 100 days basically is the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. So he promised a lot of change. He promised a lot of spending. They passed an amendment to move the inauguration so he could get into the White House sooner. So when he comes into the White House, he doesn't come in walking, he comes in running. And in the first 100 days, he passes 15 major pieces of legislation. Major pieces of legislation means these are major changes. And it's going to make the federal government way bigger, and it connects it to the economy a lot more than ever before. So he's going to pass a lot of changes that are going to allow the government to affect the economy because we needed it. People were suffering. First major action he did was called the reform banking, was to reform banking and finance, which was he closed all the banks for 4 days. It was called the bank holidays. What's the purpose for this bank holiday? Simple. All banks closed, inspections happen, and if you passed basically the inspection test, you could reopen. And if they felt that you were irresponsible as a bank and you didn't pass the inspection, you could no longer be a bank unless you fix things. So this was trying to get people to be happy with the banks and once again start putting their money into savings accounts because now they're going to only let the banks open, good banks open. All right, so they're going to continue with the banking system with passing the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act did a lot of different things to help the banks, but the most important one is the one I mentioned a little while ago, which is the Glass-Steagall Act is what set up FDIC. So basically, if you put your money in a savings account, back then it was up to $5,000. So if you have $5,000 in an account and the bank closes, FDIC, this insurance, will give you your money back, which basically meant your money was guaranteed. Either by the bank or by the insurance, you were going to get it back. So that meant people could trust the banks because their money was going to be given back to them. They continued with the farmers, with Farm Security Administration. This one gave about $1 billion worth of loans to tenant farmers. Tenant farmers are people who rent a farm in order to grow crops. The problem is that system needs to be almost perfect in order for it to work because you have to pay a lot of rent for the farms. So this one gave them loans. They could buy their own farms and just pay the loan off and eventually own their own farms. And then, of course, Agricultural Adjustment Act as well. They needed farmers, to be able to sell the crops that they grew at a higher price. So this was going to raise the prices of farm products. How do you do that? They essentially paid farmers not to farm. They told them, take a part of your land and don't farm it. We will give you money to leave that land alone. Like, just leave it alone. So that meant the rest of your land you could farm. So at the end of the year, when you cut up all your crops, you had less crops because you grew less crops. And when you multiply that by other farmers who also got paid not to farm, across the board, there is less farm products, less crops. What happens to the price of an item when there's less of it around to buy? The price goes up. So for farmers, this is a great deal. They got paid not to farm, and what they did farm was sold at a higher rate. Labor unions are going to flourish this time as well. The Wagner Act is going to give power to unions to bargain over salaries and hours. Look, business leaders took advantage of this opportunity that workers were desperate. So they basically were able to tell workers, this is how many hours you're going to work, and this is what we're going to pay you, take it or leave it. And because people were so desperate, they often took really bad deals because the owners knew they were so desperate. So the Wagner Act is going to help them out with that. FDR was definitely considered a friend of labor. Labor's the workers, and he received a lot of support. He passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set up our 40-hour work week that we have today. He increased the minimum wage, so workers by law, would get paid at least this minimum, and he made it higher. And he also set up a lot of rules for workers under the age of 16. So the Fair Labor Standards Act is still in effect today. So what happens 4 years into the New Deal? It's the next election, the 1936 election. And here is the election map for the 1936 election. He does even better than before. So if we look at the 1928 election, Democrats got destroyed. By 32, Hoover wins really easily, and 4 years later, he wins even easier. So what does that show about the first 4 years of FDR's presidency? It shows that people were happy with him, that they felt that all the changes that he made, all the acts and agencies that he created, that they worked. And he got support from so many different groups, from minorities, from women, from poor, from workers, pretty much all of society, because they were happy with him, and that's why it was such a massive victory for him. All right, we'll continue on the rest of Notes 3 on the